chat box by going to the bottom of your screen, searching for the icon that looks like a word bubble. Click on that and type in your question, press enter. I'm going to monitor the chat box, and then we'll ask those questions at the end of our tour. This tour is going to be recorded, and you'll be able to access the tour on YouTube by typing NKA Idaho in the search box. I'd also like to invite you to join us for these additional 2 VCC classes that are coming up. One is Interconnected Human Body, an interactive virtual teaching session. That's going to be on Monday, the 6th. The second VCC class that we'd like to invite you to is the Boise State University Innocence Project on Tuesday, May 21st. To register for those classes and to find out more information about them, you're going to go to aarp.org, click on the search box, and type VCC in that search box. It'll take you to the offerings. Now I'd like to introduce Riley Brown, our tour guide. In July 2023, Riley became the education technician at Minidoka National Historic Site near Jerome, Idaho. Before joining the team at Minidoka, he worked as an English teacher in Florida. Currently, Riley provides tours for school groups and assists with park operations. Riley recognizes the importance of this history, and he hopes to see more students of all kinds and ages visit this site. Riley?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that introduction, Carol. I'm super excited to come speak with you and talk a little bit about our site here at Minidoka National Historic Site. As Carol said, we're one of 10 concentration camps where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. 120,000 people were incarcerated in these places, and I really appreciate you taking time to come learn about this. It isn't an easy story to learn about. Although we're part of the National Park Service, this isn't your typical national parks site. You know, we're not gonna see beautiful waterfalls in a PowerPoint today or anything like this. So I appreciate you making space and time to host me, and also for the participants to be here. I like to start this presentation by watching this video that our park plays in our visitor center. I really like this video because the survivors tell the story themselves. Most of the people who are being interviewed lived at Minidoka when it was still in operations as a concentration camp. This history wasn't too long ago. I still get to meet survivors quite often. And it's one of my favorite parts of my job is being able to hear their stories. So with that said, I'll go ahead and share my screen and we will watch this video, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about why this happened, not just what happened here.
The day you walk through that gate, you know you lost something. There's some things in your heart that you can't forget.
We were afraid. You looked like the enemy, but citizens.
Imagine someone saying, you need to go to jail because you're Japanese American.
What did I have to do with Japan? Nothing. My family wasn't doing anything wrong, but we were paying for it.
Towers, searchlights, barbed wire fences around us. If they thought we were trying to escape, they had the right to shoot us.
We were stripped of our civil rights. We were stripped of everything. When that happens in America, that is a concentration camp.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
My dad had just purchased a home for $1,500. December 7th is the day we were moving in. And when that news came on, my dad's face, I just saw his face just drop.
Within hours, the FBI began raiding Japanese American homes up and down the West Coast.
We lived in fear because the FBI came and picked up many of the fathers of the families.
When my father was taken away, I don't think our family knew anything about where he was. This left my mother panicked as to what was going to happen to us.
They were shop owners, language teachers, Buddhist priests, law-abiding citizens. Why the FBI targeted them? They happened to be prominent in the community.
December 7th wasn't when Japanese-American prejudice started. It was decades before that. In the early 1900s, there were alien land laws and exclusion acts that kept out Japanese immigrants, and you could not apply for citizenship if you wanted to.
The majority of Japanese, when they start coming here to this country in 1860s, were farmers, laborers.
They worked hard, saved, and then invested in an operation in Japantown, starting a restaurant, a laundry, a hotel.
The Japanese lived in pretty much segregated areas like J-towns. So we were fairly isolated and largely unknown.
As long as we were laborers and working for them, no problem. When we became competition, that was a no-no for us. Then resentment, jealousy.
We were called the Yellow Peril. The newspapers, the billboards, everything was anti-Japanese.
The Japanese should be under armed guard to the last man and woman right now, and to hell with habeas corpus.
My parents had a grocery store, and my dad put up a big sign in the front window saying, "We are Americans."
A Jap's a Jap, whether he's an American citizen or not. I don't want any of them.
Our bank accounts were frozen. We could not leave our homes after 8 p.m. Many people had to close down their businesses because of the curfew.
All Japanese should be put in concentration camps for the remainder of the war. We want to keep this a white man's country.
The fate of Japanese Americans was sealed in 1942 when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066.
The West Coast commander designated the entire West Coast as a military exclusion zone, and then said anyone of Japanese ancestry would be excluded from that zone. And so you could be a newborn baby, or you could be a 90-year-old invalid.
2/3 of these Japanese Americans were citizens by birthright. With just a sweep of a pen and a couple words, you're no longer a citizen.
They said aliens and non-aliens, and we thought, who in the Sam Hill is non-aliens? That was us. They didn't dare say American citizens.
The government called it an evacuation. It wasn't an evacuation, it was a forced removal. An evacuation happens when the house is on fire and you've got to run for your safety. That's an evacuation.
To be told that they can only take what they could carry, they didn't even know where they were going. It was very terrifying for my parents.
My dad says, burn everything Japanese. So we start burning and burying everything.
My father, who had a fruit and vegetable stand, 2 of them, he had to close them down.
My parents had just bought a new tractor and delivery truck. And the crops were in. To have all of that just wiped out, taken away from them, was really devastating.
We got rid of our family possessions because General John DeWitt told us that we can only bring that which we can carry. And as a young boy, I couldn't carry very much. Most of the families got rid of everything. My mother and father in 1939 had purchased a General Electric radio, and $100 was big money at that time. They sold it to a policeman on the beat for $5. Working 15, 20, 30 years in America and having it all taken away suddenly.
Always the question is, well, why are they doing this to us? What did we do to deserve this? And of course, the answer is our face, our race.
Bainbridge Island was the first community to be rounded up and incarcerated. And they had only a week to prepare, pack, and be ready to leave.
Oh, it was difficult. It really was. I can't even find words to describe the feeling. You know, your home is your safe haven. We were herded onto the ferry and onto the train and never told us where we were going or how long we were going to be gone or anything.
We all got numbers, and we became numbers. We weren't people anymore. We were numbers.
There was nobody that stood up for us from outside of our community. If we dared to try to resist, they probably would have killed everybody, you know, without any hesitation.
The government set up 17 temporary detention facilities on the West Coast.
They drove us out to North Portland, and there we were in the ex-livestock yard.
They're living in horse stalls, and they fully expected my grandparents to be deported because they were resident aliens.
And I remember to this day the pungent odor of manure seeping through the floor, fly paper black with flies, barbed wire circling the building, army soldiers with fixed bayonet, and I as a 9-year-old looking at that, frightened.
They were saying, well, we're putting you here to protect you from people who might hurt you. Well, why were the guns pointed at us instead of at those people who weren't trying to hurt us?
One day, my father was a respectable businessman. He had a wife, a family, a car, a place in this society. He could vote. 2 weeks later, he was a prisoner in a camp surrounded by barbed wire.
We got orders towards the end of August to be ready to move. And they put us on old coal trains.
We were ordered to pull the window shades down. We were not to see where we were going. Headed east, that's all we knew.
It was a 2-day journey. We were covered with soot.
We were then ordered to deboard. We could see a sea of sagebrush. That's all we could see. And suddenly, army barracks. Hundreds and hundreds of army barracks. And somebody said that this is Minidoka.
There was a dust storm when we got off the train, and my mom grabbed my hand. I remember her saying to me, "Joni, this is our new home," and crying.
Minidoka, also called Hunt Camp, was one of 10 incarceration camps built to hold Japanese Americans from the West Coast.
Minidoka was not finished yet, but we had to move in there. And they didn't have the toilets or anything. Nothing was done.
It was really in the middle of nowhere. And there were 44 blocks Each block consisting of 12 barracks. Each barrack was 6 units from A to F. A mess hall in the middle, a laundry room in the middle, and we would eat together, we would shower together, we would do laundry together.
No privacy whatsoever, any place.
Including babies born in camp, the government imprisoned over 120,000 innocent people. Minidoka held over 13,000. Every summer, survivors and their families returned to Minidoka for an annual pilgrimage.
In our family of 5, this was our bedroom and home right here.
See?
The 5 of us in one room here.
I remember that we hung up blankets to separate, get a little privacy between your sister and yourself and things like that.
We had dust storms constantly, and we had so much dust that it would seep through the walls of the barracks.
When the wind blew, we would just suffocate in our quarters.
During the summertime, it would be boiling hot. In the wintertime, we would freeze. When it rained, we would just be in a slosh of mud.
People say, oh yeah, we complained about the food, we complained about the lodging. That wasn't it. The damage was psychological. Here you were with people, all in various stages of grief. They were in anger, they were in denial, they wanted to prove their loyalty. They were grieving the loss of their lives because their lives were stolen by the government.
My father was so withdrawn, it really destroyed him. I didn't know about suicide at that time, but if there was a way, he may have ended his own life.
There's that 2 Japanese word, shikata ga nai, that means it cannot be helped. Whatever that's happening cannot be helped. And gaman, bearing the unbearable. Those 2 words we were brought up with.
I was born in an American concentration camp. I've been able to do things with my life because of the strength of my parents and their values.
I cannot admire more the pioneering spirit of the first generation. Amongst the hardship and the loss of freedom and being stripped of civil rights, the first generation Issei's and the older Nisei's tried to make it into a livable community.
Everyone took a job, anyone who could work. I mean, they hired firemen and policemen. My mother was a seamstress. I got a job as a waitress.
My grandpa Zawa, he became the block captain. He recruited the people who had restaurants to become the cooks for the block.
Eventually, they had schools and libraries. It was like a regular community.
The mess halls would be decorated beautifully with crepe paper for special occasions, and the young adults and adults would have their dances.
Let me see your batting position.
No, I'm no hitter. The baseball team was terrific. We used to beat the other teams like 21-1. I hate to brag anything, but it was just all Japanese, second generation, and playing against these white kids that's 6 feet. It was a thrill. The whole idea was that we wanted to just play so that we could get out of camp.
After a year and a half, the American government decided we were not spies, we were not dangerous, and they gave us one-day passes. We were able to go beyond the barbed wire.
We were able to leave camp during harvest months. And we worked hard for the Idaho farmers for not very much, pay. But it was, I believe, what saved my father.
In early 1943, President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was to be a segregated Japanese-American unit that would fight in Europe. They recognized that they had to have a process for Japanese Americans to leave the camps.
The government now wanted to enlist young Japanese American men in the Army and to start moving other incarcerees to civilian life away from the West Coast.
And so they came up with the idea of a loyalty questionnaire.
Questions 27 and 28 were the ones that people talk about a lot. And the first one dealt with, are you willing to fight on behalf of the United States against all foes and enemies? And the second one was, do you swear all allegiance to the United States, and do you forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan?
How can we disavow something we never avowed to in the first place? Our allegiance is to America, and I think that many of them were insulted. How dare you ask me questions like that? I'm as good an American as you.
Those who responded with anything but an unqualified yes, yes, were branded as disloyal and were sent to Tule Lake Segregation Center, a maximum security prison in California.
It was quite an indignation for a lot of our parents to think that they wanted our boys after they had done all that to us. So there was quite a bit of controversy between the parents and the sons.
My dad volunteered without any hesitation because he was an orphan. He didn't have to get approval from his parents. And so he, without question, decided he needed to go. It was really about family honor, about hoping that they could prove their loyalty to this country.
The young man that was in our block, he was put in the penitentiary because he refused to join the Army because he says, no, you take us out of our prison here at Minidoka, then I'll go and serve. People say he brought so much shame to the family, and I don't think of it that way, Courage comes in different forms.
For its size and length of service, the 442nd would become the most decorated unit in American military history.
All the while, their mothers and fathers were incarcerated in an American concentration camp.
Two of my brothers left camp to join the 442nd. And my brother Masaru was killed in action in Italy 2 weeks before Germany surrendered.
These young men at Minidoka were really celebrated. They were thought of as heroes. Their names were placed on an honor roll.
The loyalty questionnaire marked a turning point. Individuals and families could now apply to leave camp for school, work, or resettlement away from the West Coast. But by December 1944, there were still almost 8,000 people incarcerated at Minidoka.
The exclusion order that kept Japanese Americans off the West Coast was lifted in January 1945.
We were given $25 and a ticket back to Portland, or wherever we came from.
My mother used to tell me they took us there and we didn't want to go. And then they let us go and we had nowhere to go.
My grandfather, like many of the Issei's, lost their homes, their businesses, everything. It was extremely traumatic for him.
People were afraid to go back out into a world where they knew that they would be discriminated against, that they would be hated in many ways.
My teacher hated Japanese. Erase the blackboard, throw out the garbage, wipe up dust. 27 students in the class. I did all the dirty work. She hated me. We faced overt racial prejudice.
There were bullets fired into houses in Seattle. On Vashon Island, someone burned down a Japanese farmhouse.
Throwing rocks at me and being called those names left an indelible mark on me, a feeling of inferiority.
Despite widespread hostility, there were individuals and isolated communities who welcomed their Japanese American neighbors home. Yet, in most places on the West Coast, racism persisted.
My father was this businessman who was quite successful, who now could only become a janitor.
We got married in 1955. We went to rent an apartment, and the manager took one look at us and said, "Sorry, we don't rent to Japs," and banged in the door. That was 10 years after the war ended.
My parents are the generation that went through the Depression, went through the relocation, and then went through the closing of the camps. So they basically started over 3 times.
This is why a lot of the old folks, they were depressed.
It was like a rape of a community. And we behaved like victims. We were in denial. We were silent. We were angry. We committed suicide.
It was something that we kind of shut out of our life because it was more merciful to us to forget than to talk about it.
Within the community, there was a sense that we could be taken again. So do not call attention to ourselves. Do not do bad things, or we all could be taken again.
My parents, they never complained about anything. I don't know what they were feeling, really. I didn't hear a word from them. We didn't talk about it for 40 years. Imagine.
My youngest daughter, it was on December 7th, and she says, "I hate Pearl Harbor Day because everybody turns around and looks at me like I'm the enemy." I said to her, "Honey, your daddy was a World War II hero." And she said, "I thought he fought for Japan." So that was the kind of a revelation to us that we were not doing them a favor by keeping quiet.
I think the civil rights movement in the 60s really shifted things.
The Sansei particularly were saying that the government needed to recognize that what occurred was wrong, that they wanted restitution and an apology.
Jimmy Carter, in his final year in office as president, started a bipartisan commission to look into this 40 years after the fact.
Their findings from this commission was that, one, there was no military necessity, that the causes of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans was war hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure of political leadership.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States.
Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, and it was the official apology and first step toward reparations to survivors only of this tragedy.
3 presidents signed letters of apology, and we got $20,000 each if you were alive when the act was passed. When that came out, all our parents had died. They're the ones that should have got that money. But most of them all died, and we benefited by it, which is not right, because they're the ones that suffered.
For most, the money wasn't even the issue. the apology was much more valuable.
It really helped me heal. It was like we were finally part of history.
Americans have to understand that freedom is very fragile. It's never to be taken for granted.
I remember on September 11, 2001, watching the news, and I'm hearing, this is our generation's Pearl Harbor. And the first thing that went through my mind was, I hope not.
People used to call me names just on the street, and no one spoke up for me. No one said, hey, you can't call that kid that kind of name. That's wrong. And so the whole notion was, it's okay. It's okay to call these people names. That's the situation that's been created for Muslim Americans today. We, the Japanese, are not going to be taken again. That's done with. But other group will be taken for a different reason to a different place that's essentially the same. When you see the injustice happening, you need to stand up. When you see someone being called names in public, you need to stand up.
The wrongs of the incarceration will be perpetuated unless we do things to prevent it.
Now that I've told you my story, you have a piece of that legacy to stand up. You have a piece. And should it happen again, you cannot claim ignorance. You can either say, yeah, I'm for that, or no, I'm not. And I'm hoping that reason will rule, and they will see that injustices hurt us all.
Well, hey, thank you. I hope y'all enjoyed that video. I don't know if y'all were looking at the credits, but you might have recognized the narrator's voice. That was George Takei from Star Trek. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our site specifically, and then what led to the incarceration at Minidoka. I really appreciated all the people in the video who told their stories about their time here. And then if you have questions, please just drop them in the chat. There's a good chance I might answer some of those questions with the PowerPoint, but I will be happy to answer the ones that I don't answer through the PowerPoint afterwards. So let me share my screen. Okay, so above our door at our visitor center, we have this quote by Frank Kitamoto. He says that this story is not just a Japanese American story, but an American story with implications for the world. Now, one of my favorite things about working at Minidoka National Historic Site is that I get to meet new people from all over the world. I have met people who never even knew about this, who came from countries in Europe where they don't really focus on American history, and they learn about this for the first time. Oftentimes they're on oftentimes people are on road trips to Yellowstone. We're kind of on the way to Yellowstone if you were to come from Seattle or Portland, a major metropolitan area. And so they might come and visit our site just because, we have those national park stamps. If you know about those, you can get this little booklet, and people like to collect stamps. And so they come just because, we're part of NPS and they want to check it out. And then they hear about the story for the first time. Then on the flip side, I meet people who are intimately connected with this story. This story is something that's affected their lives because either they lived there, like they were survivors, or because their grandparents or their parents lived there. I often get grandkids who come in and tell me, Ranger Riley, my grandma and my grandpa were here, but they won't talk about it at all. All they said is they met here, or all they said is the food was bad, or, because sometimes it's just too painful for them to talk about. But whoever it is, whether I'm talking with a group of people who's never heard about it, whether I'm talking to grandkids of survivors, or whether I'm talking to an AARP group over Zoom, whoever you are, when you hear about this story, it has implications for you and how you live your life and how you treat others with dignity and respect. At the National Park Service, you might be wondering, like, how in the world did this site become part of us, right? A lot of times people know us for preserving our natural history and our natural resources. We also preserve cultural resources. So there's kind of a breakdown of what the NPS does with our badge that we like to do. That this tree kind of represents one of the things we preserve, which is nature. We like to point out to the mountain because we preserve scenic views and beauty. We preserve resources such as this water. And then we have the bison here because it's actually not just an animal and wildlife, but it's also very cultural. Like the bison is very cultural to America. And so we're trying to preserve American culture. And so this is one of those sites where we're trying to preserve a culture where we point out what happened at Minidoka so that it doesn't get lost. There's 5 phases when we think about what led up to incarceration. Because when you think about this, it didn't happen overnight. Oftentimes, I even still get teachers or school groups come up and they try and make the claim that this all happened because of Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor did play a big role, but it wasn't where this starts, right? So the late 1800s is really where our story begins. So immigration starts happening in mass. Um, you have you have Japan finally open up, and they start allowing people to move out and foreigners to do business within. And so in the late 1800s, you have a good bit of Japanese Americans moving to the US, first to Hawaii and then on the West Coast. This is also partly because there was other anti-Asian laws happening. So that Chinese Exclusion Act opened up a window for Japanese Americans to pursue work because train tracks, railroads still needed people to work on them. They were still looking for laborers to take lower wages, and immigrants were often more willing to take these lower wages. And so when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed and Chinese people were banned from immigrating to the US, then Japanese Americans sort of took their place in filling a lot of those jobs. Of course, it's sort of whack-a-mole for the people with racial prejudice and sort of bigoted policies. And so as soon as, Chinese Americans are no longer coming and Japanese Americans are replacing them, these same people are thinking, how do we make laws to prevent Japanese Americans from also taking some of this work, from moving in and taking some of the railroad jobs. And so there was many laws set up in order to prevent Japanese Americans from owning land. So for instance, there was a law that prevented you from becoming a citizen if you were not born in the US. So often the Issei, that's the first generation Japanese Americans, they usually, well, not just usually, they were never able to naturalize as citizens until way after the war. And then their children, the Nisei, the second generation, would be able to naturalize. But this made sort of a complicated situation because the first generation would not be able to own land in California and then in later states because California purposefully passed laws that said if you're not an American citizen, then you can't own land there. So they created a lot of these laws specifically to prevent Japanese Americans from owning land, from becoming citizens, and to keep them sort of at bay. As this tension is growing, Pearl Harbor does, happen. And when Pearl Harbor happens, it's kind of the perfect storm for people to enact policies that they've been pushing for. So you have a lot of groups that were already wanting Asian Americans off the West Coast. And then when Pearl Harbor happens, a lot of people give in to mass hysteria and they get very afraid. And so they were able to convince Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, to sign Executive Order 9066, which allowed General John DeWitt to have very strong control over the West Coast and move people for safety. Of course, later on, they found out there was no military necessity for this. There's nobody really suspected of spying. Also, before Executive Order 9066 was signed, they had already rounded up people that they suspected and interned them. Executive Order 9066 was very specifically to move people en masse from the West Coast into concentration camps. And there was 120,000 of these people. Something that's really important to us at the national parks is terminology and words. And so we say these people were in concentration camps and not internment because internment has a very specific legal definition outlawed by the Geneva Convention. And you can only intern people who are not American citizens. Well, you can only intern people who are not citizens of your country and who you're at war with. And 2/3 of the people who were at Minidoka were American citizens by birth and legal standing. And they were still forcibly removed from their houses and put into the concentration camp. At Minidoka, the incarceration was from 1942 to 1945. Some other places were longer. Like I told you, there was people who had suspicions. And when I say suspicions, some of these suspicions are really benign. So for instance, you could be a Buddhist priest, you could teach martial arts, you could work at a school that taught Japanese language. And these were all grounds for you to be investigated as a first generation. And so some of these people who were interned at some of the military points outside of the concentration camps would have stayed there for longer. I think 1948 is when Crystal City finally shut down. But Minidoka specifically was open from 1942 to 1945. In 1945, the war was ending. A lot of people were resettling, and there wasn't really a concerted effort to address this. There were some laws put in place, some methods of trying to find restitution, but they were largely ineffective and without a backing. And it wasn't until around the civil rights movement when people started pushing for reparations and redress. First, under the Jimmy Carter administration, they put out a commission to find out the causes of what happened, and then also to find out some of the implications of that, both about Japanese American incarceration and also some of the things that happened up in Alaska with some Native American people. And so once that commission came out, it was a strong grounds to push for reparations and redress, and they were ultimately successful, starting with Reagan apologizing, and then there was letters of apology and reparations sent all the way up to George W. Bush's administration as they continued to find people who were lived through this situation and who they owed an apology to. Those are the four, and then the last after the 90s is sort of what we have going today. Here at Minidoka in July, we're going to be having one of our pilgrimages. This is a picture of the ribbon cutting for our first visitor center, and we have survivors, descendants, and people with vested interest in Minidoka come out every year to remember, to honor the people who survived, to hear their stories, to reflect on what this dark chapter in American history means for us today. And it's a really great thing to be a part of. Now, pilgrimages, while they're sort of the remains of what happens today, have been happening since the civil rights movement. The pilgrimages were actually some of the ways that people were able to gather and push for reparations and redress. They were able to organize and get together and figure out exactly what they wanted from the U.S. government. What did an apology look like? And so they've been an important part of talking about this history and pushing for its recognition. The video kind of touched about this, about why did it happen. And as I also mentioned, like a lot of times people will say, you know, it happened because of Pearl Harbor, or it happened because people were afraid. And that's partly it. But ultimately, when you look at the records, when you look at what the government said behind closed doors with the Freedom of Information Act, we realize that the government knew all along that this was not necessary. And so the commission that was put out by Jimmy Carter came up with 3 reasons. Well, why is my slide not working? Racial prejudice is one. And this is a historic photo of something that happened in California, right? So I'm not going to say this word, but keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Racial prejudices were high at the time. And this is not to say that this was everybody. There's plenty of stories of people thinking that the incarceration camps were wrong. There's plenty of stories of people reaching out and helping in the ways they could. The Quakers were notorious for helping people resettle outside of the camp. There was lots of people who recognized the evil in this, but there was many people who still had racial prejudice against Japanese Americans, and there's countless stories of Japanese Americans facing that both before the war and then after the war. So one of the main reasons is racial prejudice. The second is war hysteria. People were afraid. Whenever I talk to kids, because I often focus on working with young children as my position as the education tech, you know, hysteria can be a big word for them. But sometimes I think it can be a big word for us too as adults, right? And so sometimes I tell them, you know, hysteria is when you give in to that unhealthy fear. Say sometimes it's good to be afraid, right? Like maybe you're afraid of burning yourself on a stove. Or maybe if you're hiking, you're afraid of walking too close to the ledge. These are very healthy fears, and you should listen to those fears. But sometimes you're afraid when you really shouldn't be. And you know, when I'm talking to kids, I'll say, you know, maybe you're getting a little bit afraid of ghosts, or you're afraid something's in your closet or something like that. And this is kind of what happened here, is that just because the country of Japan attacked the US did not mean that people who looked like them ethnically were the enemy. But people started believing silly things. And then a lot of times this information was put out by newspapers, news articles that were written by some of these same groups who wanted to see Japanese Americans exit California because they were too competitive with the farming, who wanted to see them exit Seattle. To give you an idea about how good Japanese Americans were at farming, if you've ever been to Pike's Place Market, I think most of us have heard of it in Seattle. It's a great place, and in the 1940s and 1942, it was actually staffed 80% with Japanese American farmers. So they were very big into the farming industry, and there was lots of people who wanted to see them moved. And so when Pearl Harbor happens, there's newspapers written about with unfounded claims about spies and fifth column activity and things of that sort, and people bought it. And then the last is the failure of political leadership. As I said, we call this a concentration camp, and one of the reasons we do that is because it's both accurate and historical. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and all his private correspondents before they announced this to the public referred to this as a concentration camp. It wasn't until they released it to the public and then handed out pamphlets to the Japanese Americans who were being forcibly removed that they gave them a list of terminology. There's actually this interesting document where you can see the terms they were told to use. They were told to use it, call it a relocation center. They were told to say this was relocation, not forced removal. They weren't prisoners or incarcerees, but they were pioneers, right? And I think that when when somebody purposely changes the words, when they've been using a word that is accurate and they purposely change it, I think that sort of implies that they know that if they said this truthfully and honestly, that it would be unacceptable, that it would be wrong. And so the government really failed its people. Now, to give you a little bit of a layout of the land, there's 10 of these, so each 10 concentration camps. So each triangle is one of the concentration camps, and the big red star is Minidoka. So we're in southern Idaho. Tule Lake, the one that got turned into a high security prison, is in northern California. Manzanar is in central California. Poston and Gila River are in Arizona. And interestingly enough about those two is that they're on Native American land. And so it's a very complicated history about how those came out to be. Grenada is often called Amachi. So it's called Amachi National Historic Site. It recently got added. And that it was in Colorado. Topaz is in Utah. Heart Mountain is in Wyoming. And then Rower and Jerome are both in Arkansas. All the stars are different places that people might have been incarcerated, but were incarcerated not in mass concentration camps, but at prisoner of war camps. And this is just a different map of the specifically NPS ran sites. Many of these places have museums, but the national parks takes care of 4: Tule Lake, Manzanar, Minidoka, and Amachi or Grenada. We also have a site in Hawaii that incarcerated people, but again was not quite a concentration camp. A little bit about these terms that I talked about. So Japanese relocation, right? We like to say Japanese American incarceration, right? They weren't just relocated. They were forced out of their homes. They often lost their businesses. They lost their homes because they defaulted on mortgages. A relocation kind of implies that you were doing it for their benefit. This was not for the benefit of the Japanese Americans, and it was not for the benefit of the other citizens either. It was an incarceration. It was putting them in a place, basically a jail that they did not want to be in. Evacuation, same sentiment. It's forced removal. Instead of internee, we say survivor, because again, internee is just not inaccurate based on the Geneva Convention, and same with internment, we call them concentration camps. Now, a lot of times when people hear this, and I thought this when I first started working at Minidoka, is like concentration camp. You kind of think of what happened in Auschwitz, right? You kind of think about Nazi Germany, and even kids, because kids, they're not afraid to ask any questions. They'll say, "Hey, did people get killed en masse? Did they put them in gas chambers like Nazi Germany?" And I'll say, "No, they didn't do that. They didn't do that here." But I think that maybe we can look at that a little bit differently. So the first thing I want to do is read this joint statement in 1998 from the Japanese American National Museum and the American Jewish Committee. They said that a concentration camp is a place where people are imprisoned, not because of any crimes they've committed, but simply because of who they are. The people in power removed a minority group from the general population, and the rest of society let it happen. And so I think concentration camp is accurate to both what happened to the Japanese Americans and then also what first happened to the Jewish people over in Nazi Germany. But I think it's also better to maybe push that further and call places like Auschwitz death camps or killing centers, because they didn't just start with putting lots of people in one place, but they ended up killing them in mass. And so I think that maybe concentration camp can become a little bit of a euphemism for what happened there. There are some laws. I don't think I'm going to go over them in this presentation because I think it's better to preserve some time for some questions. But I highly encourage you to look up some laws such as the Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Reclamation Act, the Gentleman's Agreement, Alien Land Laws, Immigration Acts, because they really tell you about what led up to this. As I mentioned about Executive Order 9066, it was signed and then it allowed people to be taken away. They were only given 1 to 2 weeks notice. They really didn't have much time to sell homes. They could only bring what they could carry. And a lot of people had to sell things for pennies on the dollar. There's lots of stories of people just kind of leaving their belongings out in front of their houses, and before they were even fully removed, scavengers coming to pick up their lost belongings. They had to wear tags with numbers for identification, and many of the survivors will tell you still remember those numbers. So it's really sad because you have these pictures of men and women and children just kind of looking like the luggage that they're carrying as they're being forcibly removed. There was over 13,000 people incarcerated here at Minidoka. Our camp is shaped sort of like a crescent moon in order to go with the North Side Canal because it was used as a farming camp. And they actually turned a lot of desert landscape into farmable land. And then after they turned it into farmable land, they farmed it along with 2 other concentration camps that were farm camps. And they produced all the vegetables and food for the concentration camps. This is another map view of it. Each of these blocks would have had about 16 buildings, and then there are about 40. There's over 640 buildings on our camp. It was named after the Minidoka Irrigation Project, as I told you. It was used as a farm camp, and so there was actually an agreement between the WRA and the Bureau of Reclamation to provide labor in exchange for the use of the land. So it needed to be on federal land where they put this, and so the people were paid $12 a month to turn this into farmable land. $12 a month is about 10% of what they would have made in Alaska, Oregon, and Washington. Eventually, after these people were incarcerated, turned this land into farmland, trying to make things, livable for themselves, they get the loyalty questionnaire, and they are either deemed loyal or not loyal. Japanese Americans and Minidoka, 98% of them were deemed loyal at Minidoka, and only 2% were sent to Tule Lake. I think largely because the administration made it very clear about the implications of the loyalty questionnaire, unlike at some of the other camps. And then they could have either volunteer or were eventually drafted into the 442nd. Out of all the camps, Minidoka sent 25% of the military volunteers to fight in the war. Eventually, the land was returned to the Bureau of Reclamation for a lottery where veterans could enter the lottery and receive a plot of land. A lot of the land is still farmland that was either bought up by larger farmers or still remains as homesteading farmland. We often get people coming to our site who talked about growing up there as their dad was a farmer who was a veteran of World War II and finding things from the site, such as marbles or silverware that had been dropped in the dirt as the camp closed. The incarcerees were only given $25 when they were forced out and a ticket to wherever they would go. And I say forced out because some of these people had to go before they wanted to. In fact, there's a story at Minidoka of a woman who had 4 kids, and her husband was supposed to come back from the 442nd a week after her due date to leave the camp. And so she asked if it could be rescheduled, if they could push it back so that her husband could be on the train with her to help take care of the kids. And the camp told her no, and said she had to be out by that date. So many people were forced out. After the war, many people returned to the coast, but they weren't well received. A lot of this sentiment had grown to a real boiling point. And, when your government tells you that these people are so dangerous, you have to put them in a concentration camp. It often means that you believe them. And so people thought these people might still be dangerous and still held resentment against them, and they were often treated unfairly. Here are some reflections by survivors just about what the camp was like. This person said it is unendurably hot and dusty, though eventually I'll get used to it. Sylvia Kobayashi said, I want to forget the day we were herded like cattle into a prison camp. What did we do wrong? What was our crime? This person said, Minidoka was part of my childhood. I would like to see my grandkids understand what happened here. Gene Akutsu is a great story. He said, I never swore allegiance to Japan. I've always been an American and pledged allegiance to our flag all my life. These are some Densho sites of shame. You can go to densho.org and find out how they're all connected to our history. And then these are some pictures of our site and what we have here if you ever want to come visit. We have this guard tower that's been reconstructed. The military police checkpoint, the second picture on the top, in the middle is the only thing that remained when this was originally a national monument. And it wasn't until later that we expanded our footprint and got more of the land. We don't have all of it, and I don't think we have plans to have all of it, but we have a larger footprint where we can talk more thoroughly about what happened here. One of our most recent projects is this honor roll board. In World War II, it was often that communities would put together an honor roll board where they had the names of people serving. So maybe at your church group, you'd have this board with all of the people who were a member of your church who were also serving in the military. And so they made an honor roll board for all the men who were serving and who had family incarcerated in Minidoka. So we had a historic photo, and we recreated the middle panel from that. The side panels were too blurry, so our previous ranger put out an open call and did a lot of research to get as many names as possible, people who might have been incarcerated at Minidoka and who also served in World War II. And she added those names on the side panels. It's still a work in progress. This picture on the bottom left is part of our visitor center with one of our rangers and actually her grandmother who's incarcerated here. And then the middle bottom is a picture of the two historic buildings besides our visitor center that we have. And if you ever come, you can go inside and see what their living conditions would have been like. This is kind of our old staff. We need to update it, but Kurt is still around. He is my boss, and this is inside our visitor center. That is really all I have. Thank you so much for listening to this, and I hope that explained a little bit more about why this happened and what happened here. And if we have time for questions, I think we do. I would love to take those.
All right. Before we read the questions, I want to thank you, Riley, for this tour of such an important historical site. We need to remember, as Winston Churchill said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That's a very powerful quote and very pertinent now. Before I read questions, just to give you an idea of the wide audience we had, I'm going to scroll quickly through the chat box and let you know where people are from. Nebraska, Delaware, New York, Washington, Boise, well, Idaho, Montana, Nevada. Let's see, the fresh coast of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And let's see. JH is from Reno, and she says that her mother's sister was, let's see, my mother's side of the family was incarcerated at Minidoka. Okay, let's see if there are any more locations. Seattle, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Oh, and okay, Texas. All right, now there were several people who asked if the video would be available. So if you look in the chat box, again, I've typed the link to YouTube. All
Fantastic.
right. Then, okay, questions and comments. KK asks, were the Japanese families relocated from territorial Alaska sent to incarceration camps like Minidoka?
Yes, they were. So basically everybody from territorial Alaska would have been sent to Minidoka. Some of the other camps split up some of the more populous areas. So for instance, LA has a very interesting map of how they were split up. But Minidoka is unique because there is less Japanese Americans in Alaska and Oregon. I think Washington was the only state besides California that had some people split up. So Seattle, some people went to Heart Mountain, but otherwise, if you were in Oregon, if you were in Alaska, and you were in Washington, you got sent to Minidoka.
Okay, this one is a comment from DB. And this is what I was thinking also as you were talking. This was not taught in our history class. I only learned from it when they were discussing reparations. So very true. Okay, I'm scrolling through. There are a lot of kudos and thank you, Riley's, for sharing information. I'm looking for questions first, though.
Yeah.
What
Well, while
was
you
the-
are, I can mention something about that. I often get that comment. And something about that is that if you graduated high school before the 80s, that was purposeful that you didn't learn about it because it wasn't talked about. So during redress and reparations, one of the things they pushed for is that it would be taught in American high schools and middle schools. And so, yeah, that was purposeful. It was not something that the U.S. government was proud of. It was not something that was public. And in fact, a lot of the details did not come to light until later after the Freedom of Information Act. Many people did not know that Japanese Americans contributed to the war effort in the MIS, for instance, as translators and spies, if you will, for America. And so, yeah, it's not uncommon if you graduated before the 1980s to not have heard about this in school.
Okay, another question from J.A. Did Riley receive training in dealing with people who experienced the trauma of concentration camps or who experienced generational trauma from those who did? The Minidoka camp must generate so much trauma for visitors.
Yeah, we talk about that quite often. Yeah, it's not like by a third party agency or anything, but my boss and my previous mentor. Um, we've talked about that quite often. It does generate a lot of generational trauma. I'm very blessed to work in a place like this. I feel that it's a privilege to be able to meet all these people who get to tell me about their stories at the place I work at. And so, yeah, I've gotten a little bit of training there, but it's still difficult. It's still something you got to be very careful of, especially as I talk to people often and in front of a crowd like this, and you got to be mindful of who can be in that crowd and what people are allowed to say and who they're cognizant of saying it in front of. So yeah, short answer, yes. Mhm.
Okay, and as I'm scrolling through, got a lot of messages. So as I'm scrolling through, there were a couple of questions that people posed that were actually answered by other audience members. So we'll kind of skip over those. Yeah, that's pretty cool. All right, here's a comment from KF. AAPI violence is still a minimized hidden issue. Yeah, and then someone else added on to that. JH added on to that comment the violent attacks on Asian Americans, not just Chinese, during the early days of COVID were pretty terrifying. And I know we remember that. Okay, another question from CM. How many people were forced to live in each building?
Yeah, so a barrack would have housed 6 families each. Um, on average, you're looking at 4 or 5 people. The rooms were different sizes. They call the rooms apartments, another euphemism. So you might have a small room with 2 or 3 people, and then right next to it was a larger room with 6 to 8. So there's no specific number per barrack, but it would have been 6 families each, roughly an average of 5 people. So
All right.
60-ish. Or I'm
Okay.
sorry, 30-ish people.
All right, and actually, as I'm scrolling down, we have some additional states, Virginia and Connecticut.
Mhm.
Notice I said the C in Connecticut.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, no, Connecticut. All right, California, Miami, okay,
I'm from
Utah,
Florida.
Ohio. Lots of kudos. Okay, here's another question. Was the relocation ever challenged legally while it was going on?
Yes, it was. There was several different ways it was challenged legally. The curfew was challenged because there was a curfew before relocation, and then it went on while they were relocating them because it was a 2-week process. The actual relocation was challenged. Um, the ability for the U.S. to draft people who were in incarceration camps was challenged. There was several organizations that were challenging things legally, like similar today. Usually when something goes to the Supreme Court, people kind of know it's going to go to the Supreme Court. People are pushing for it to go to the Supreme Court. So some legal organizations would identify certain people who they realized would be a great case, such as Gordon Hirabashi. Gordon Hirabashi has this amazing story. He was a Quaker pacifist, and he specifically resisted both the curfew and the relocation. And he purposely got arrested. He actually was walking outside of curfew, and a cop saw him and just told him to go home. And he's like, "I'm not going home. Do you want to arrest me?" And the cop was like, "No, I'm not going to arrest you." And he had to go to another cop to get arrested. And he did this so that he could challenge it in the court.
All right. This is a comment, a kernel of wisdom from one of our New Knowledge Adventure members from Boise,
Okay.
Gypsy. First of all, she says these stories are so important to remember. It's worth remembering, too, that Minidoka is on Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute homelands. Minidoka is
Yes, it
said
is.
to mean broad expanse in Shoshone. And she asks, do you also mention Minidoka's indigenous history in the exhibits?
That's a really cool question. So, the answer is currently no, but hopefully very soon you're going to see some new waysides that will mention the Shoshone Bannock people. We've been working with Nolan Brown, who is a representative for the Shoshone Bannock people, who works in their cultural history department, and some of his other colleagues about some waysides that will hopefully be put up at Minidoka. Now, we're the federal government. The federal government can move a little bit slow, so don't expect those to see those this summer. But they should be finished up soonish on government time. Hopefully, maybe next summer they'll be out, and I'm very excited about that. We've gotten specifically cultural input to make sure that they're appropriate and accurate. Good question.
All right. And again, there are several people asking how to view the video. If you will go through the chat box, I've put in bold the YouTube link to access. Okay, I'm scrolling still. Okay. Gypsy again asks, could you please comment on the economic recovery of the people? I recall a small reparation, which I think you talked about briefly, but it couldn't possibly have compensated for the loss of the Japanese Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. So the reparations are very tricky because everybody has different feelings about them. When I say everybody, I mean the Japanese Americans who received them. For some people, it meant a lot that it was a gesture, right? And they really appreciate it. And for others, they feel like there's really no reconciliation, right? And so you can't really speak with a monolith for it. And each situation, not only is their personal feelings different, but also their financial situations are different. Some people were really strucken by this financially and never recovered. And then other people were fortunate to have friends and family or relative, well, not family, but relative people in their community, friends and community members who held on to their business, who took care of them, right? And they were able to recover sooner, right? Faster. The reparations were $20,000, but only for people who survived. So if you died, if you're an elderly person who had passed away before the 80s, your kids did not get it. It was only if you were incarcerated yourself, and that was $20,000.
All right, we have a few more questions. DS asks, what was happening at Minidoka between 1945 and the Civil Rights Movement? Was it abandoned or in use in some other way?
Yeah, pretty much it was abandoned. Most of it was farmland because most of the land had been turned into farmland. Our offices are actually a homesteading farmer's house, his prior house. So where I work is an old farmhouse. I still know his kids. They occasionally come out just to see the site and also just check out their old house. And there were some places that weren't ever really used for anything, just kind of sat there. It's desert landscape, so like where the checkpoint is, that building just kind of dilapidated and fell into disuse. And it wasn't until the 90s that people started really revisiting it. The JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, did some work there unofficially, and then they started advocating for it to be a National Historic Site. And it actually wasn't even a National Historic Site until 2001. It was one of Clinton's last moves in office to designate it as a national monument.
All right, we have a comment from SO. Thank you for this presentation. My mother's family were incarcerated at Minidoka. I visited the site 5 years ago and look forward to seeing the new visitor center one day and Amache, or however you pronounce it, where my father's
Amache,
family
yeah.
was incarcerated. Okay, then another question. JM asks, how are the medical needs attended to those in the camps?
There was hospitals, but most everything was understaffed. Many of these jobs were fulfilled by Japanese Americans who were being paid significantly less than they should have been. But there was hospitals. There is a story of a woman who actually walked through the snow on Christmas Day to deliver a baby, only to find out that there was nobody at the hospital and had to start knocking on the staff's quarters for somebody to go find her one. But they would have had hospitals.
Okay, and I see one more comment and one more question. SB says, thank you very much. I am Japanese American born in Hawaii. Japanese Americans, most there in Hawaii, were not put in camps, but they weren't treated very well either. This history about what happened to American citizens should not be forgotten. And that echoes Winston Churchill's quote. Okay, and the last question that I see is a follow-up about the legal challenges. Were any of the legal challenges successful?
Yes, short answer, but it took a long time. So there was 3 of the main legal challenges were all denied. But one of them came back later, and 3 of them were unsuccessful. And then one came back that was like slightly unrelated, but it was enough to get the concentration camp shut down. So the Supreme Court actually ruled that they were unconstitutional while the war was happening, like near the end of the war, but they were already planning on shutting down the camps. So it just wasn't timely enough. And then the 3 that I mentioned that were unsuccessful, years later, they came up across the Supreme Court again, and it was overturned. But it was largely symbolic. By that time, everybody had really moved on. So yes, there was some successes, but the successes, they still stand because it's still in the Supreme Court. It's still there, but for the sake of the people and how they were treated, it just wasn't timely enough for it to make a difference.
All right, one last comment, and then I have a couple of closing remarks. LB says, 10 years ago, my daughter, while in high school, was asked whether her kind was going to attack again. She's half Japanese, half Caucasian. I can't believe that this prejudice still exists. I was speechless when she mentioned it, but we talked about it. Yes, that's a teachable moment, isn't it? That was my comment, the teachable moment.
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry to hear that. That shouldn't happen, and it's really unfortunate. I hope that places like Minidoka can help combat stuff like that and some of those racist sentiments.
Yes. Well, Riley, thank you so much.
Thank y'all.
I hope you'll get a chance. There are too many kudos in the chat box for me to read them. So if you'll scroll through them.
Will
One
do.
last reminder for people, and then I'll put a couple of links in the chat box again. Please also remember to join us for these 2 new Knowledge Adventures VCC classes, Interconnected Human Body, and it's an interactive virtual teaching session on Monday, this coming Monday, May 6th. And then this is an exciting one. The BSU, Boise State University, has the Innocence Project that has used DNA to exonerate criminals. And we're having a virtual presentation on that on Tuesday, May 21st, 2024. Again, to register for those classes, I will put the link in right now as I speak, maybe. There's the link to register for the New Knowledge, or the VCC New Knowledge Adventures class. And once again, here we go again in bold. Here is the YouTube link to view this class or to have friends and relatives view the class. Again, thank you so much, Riley. Thank you, everyone, for joining us from across the country. Goodbye, everyone.